Thanks for a really interesting talk. I have two questions for you. One is, how would some of those initial graphs that you showed us change if you were measuring things according to the median rather than the mean, so that you reduce the skew on, say, the income effects or whatever of people being very wealthy in a population? And then the second is, if it...
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question. How would
the various relationships that you showed at the beginning of the talk change if you weren't using the mean but you were using the median? And the second one is, if it turned out that there really is a robust relationship between, there is not a robust relationship between well-being and income, do you think that mainstream welfare economists would change how they do their work?
Okay. On the latter question, I think that there is a robust relationship between well-being and income. You know, it's not clear that, you know, it's clear there's some diminishing marginal returns, right? But we know that even for hedonic well-being or daily experience well-being, not having enough income is bad, right? So, you know, it gets more complicated at higher levels of income. So I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm not sure how much welfare economists will change, but they may use the metrics to see how other things matter and why the relationship is more complicated at the top end of the income scale. And on mean versus median, it's a very good question, obviously. And I think you'd get some variance, particularly depending on how, for example, equal or unequal access to things like healthcare and other things are. And I think you'd also get variance depending on just how unequal countries were, right? I mean, because then just because the distance between the mean and the median would be so much higher. But I think probably some of that difference is already picked up by the income variable in the equations. In other words, you do get quite a strong correlation within, you know, across individuals controlling for the country they live in. You get a very strong income coefficient. So you're getting some of the difference between the mean and the median. And then I guess on the average per capita ones, where you're saying you could change the mean and the median. I don't know. You also, I mean, one question is, we're looking at average rates of happiness. Maybe we should change the mean and the median on happiness as well, because there's also, I've been doing some work looking at the well-being distribution, not the income distribution, and seeing how different people at different points in the well-being distribution value these different things. And we find, for example, that the happiest people care least about money, but they care about learning and they care about friendships and other things. The least happy people are made the most unhappy by unemployment, and money, you know, matters a lot. Money matters more than it does to the happiest people. So there's almost like a crossing. But I actually think that, at least from the point of view of well-being, understanding where people in the well-being distribution are and how that correlates with these variables is some of the most interesting stuff going on.
Hi, it's Vanessa. I was thinking a little bit about the intertemporal issue that you've got highlighted here, and it was bringing up some thinking about happiness, well-being in relationship. John Helliwell from the University of British Columbia talks a lot about reported life satisfaction, and one of the things he's found, as you probably know, is that when people give, when they give to others, or if they're kind of altruistic, that they gain satisfaction from that as well. And you mentioned friendship, but he was also saying that feelings of trust are another piece of the puzzle, as well as self-efficacy and having a baseline standard. So that was the first part of the relationship piece. And the other one was about, we were talking about this a little bit at our table, about how happiness, in snapshots, you know, when people are saying, oh, this is how I feel in this moment, as compared to happiness about having gone through struggles and coming out the other side. So when you look at the financial crisis and then afterwards people are even more relieved or more happy, when people go through crisis, then they often come out the other side and say, you know, I feel like I've gone through the worst of it and I feel stronger because of it. So I just was wondering whether or not there is that kind of following things through, self-development, for example, or people going through challenges and coming out the other side. So giving, trust, and that kind of self-development part of happiness.
Okay, very good questions. So on the giving and trust and friendship, on altruism, we know that people who are altruistic are happier, but what we don't know is the direction of causality. So is it that happier people are more likely to be altruistic, or altruistic, you know, or altruism really makes people happier? Probably two ways. In the same way with religion, we find that on average people who have faith are happier than those that don't around the world. And then there's other studies of religion and well-being that suggest that religious people are happier than non-religious people. None of those findings hold, I've found, in places where religion is an extreme or divisive force. You know, where all of a sudden it's splitting countries, or, you know, the identity has to be very strong. But it goes back to your kind of altruism and friendship thing. This one study of, which is just looking at Protestants and Catholics and atheists in Europe, where religion is not particularly divisive, finds that even atheists are happier in neighborhoods with more religious people. So that has something to do, I think, with the fact that there's kind of positive social externalities. There's probably some focus on altruism, or, you know, and there's sort of the social side of religion that's obviously linked to well-being. And I think all of that links to Halliwell's trust findings. And I know John very well. The trust findings are also a little bit like the altruism finding. You know, happier people trust others more. Living somewhere where everybody trusts each other is associated with higher levels of well-being. So what's the direction of causality? We don't really know. The self-development question is a great one, and that's one of the things we're trying to develop the metrics to answer. There are clearly differences in just being happy at the moment. We can measure that with being, you know, longer life evaluations of well-being, which would suggest the kind of self-development thing. And, you know, for example, we find that educated people are more happy than non-educated people, but educated people are also have more stress, right? So that there's kind of this attaining self-development may not be associated with happiness in the daily experience sense, although it's probably associated with happiness in the life evaluation sense. And then again, we want better measures of this eudaimonic dimension of where people really are reporting about the purpose or meaning in their lives. But we know least about that.
Maybe you want to step up.
Hi. I was thinking about the work that Robert Frank has done recently, and so what he argues is that there's some spending is purely for positional reasons, right? So, you know, some things you do basically to keep up with the Joneses. And so I'm wondering if so there is a relationship between income, or, you know, wealth and happiness. But once you've covered your basic needs, the question is, does that spending lead to fulfilling lives, or is it just this positional type spending? And I think what he's arguing is that it's not leading to fulfilling lives, and that's, you know, that, and I'm just wondering where that plays into your research.
Well, I love his work, and he's a good colleague and friend. So, I think he's focusing on extreme levels of top-driven inequality, and then this sort of drive for positional goods at the top, and how that makes people in the middle feel compelled to spend, even it means they don't have to keep up, even through the school quality channel. And I think it's very good work. The findings that I was talking about, where we found that income correlates with evaluative well-being, but not with experience well-being, kind of all the way up the ladder, is a little bit more an aggregate level finding. And there are probably some people at the top end of the scale who may be using their higher levels of income to purchase more positional goods, and they think that makes them happier, or makes them happy. That's what they report. There are plenty of other people, and you have to remember the data that we have, income data that we have, for example, in Gallup Daily, it's not catching the big incomes at the top. You're talking about people, up to the 200K a year range, probably at most. And there, I think you're comparing people who have enough money to make the choices they want to make in their lives with those that don't. So I don't think we're picking up the whole positional goods thing as much as just, maybe how much income it takes in today's U.S. society to be in a position to go to the schools you want to go to and to get the career you want to get to, and all, and that's increasingly higher up the income ladder. I mean.
So I was thinking a bit about the results on uncertainty. So it appears from what you said that uncertainty is something that makes people really unhappy. Well, the biggest uncertainty that the entire human race is facing is extinction due to climate change and various other accompanying disasters. So isn't it a reasonable public policy finding that the unhappiness with uncertainty reinforces the case for doing something about climate change? And shouldn't people who are working on the policy implications of happiness make that connection?
Well, it's sort of somebody that does a lot of work on behavioral economics. I think the problem is just people are hyperbolic discounters, and the uncertainty that you are talking about is very clearly there, but it's a very long-term time horizon. And people's behavior is driven a lot, certainly in terms of daily experience or quality of life, is driven a lot by well-being at the moment, and even the life purpose stuff. It's usually about your life, not the life of your children, the questions as they are posed. So I think the time horizon is too short. That said, I mean, the metrics are very well suited for measuring the immediate well-being effects of living in, for example, unpredictable weather situations, right? We actually tried to look at that, with looking at the big climatic disasters like Hurricane Irene and the Snowmageddon, and trying to see how people responded to the uncertainty surrounding those events. And that would be a good way to say, look, if this is a result of climate change, it's having effects on today's well-being. There's some studies that have looked at the effect of environmental quality and well-being, the effect of airplane noise on well-being. The problem with those is that what you typically find is, yes, things like pollution and airplane noise are bad for well-being, but people also adapt to these things. So people who are used to worse environments or a lot of airplane noise adapt to it at least somewhat. So you kind of have to change the norm, or worse norms. Because people adapt to worse norms, they'll tolerate worse conditions, and you need a change in the conditions, again, a change which produces some sort of uncertainty to produce a well-being effect.
Two quick questions, and again, wonderful presentation, thanks. First, how skeptical are you and others in your field about the best possible life framing when we have increasing research showing that we're poor predictors of how we will increase our happiness or other measures of subjective well-being by, for example, acquiring this or that or changing certain aspects of our lives? We're poor predictors of our future other measures of subjective well-being. Secondly, I share your enthusiasm for the eudaimonic frame, and I've been a long time fan of the self-determination theory literature. Do folks like Dishi and Ryan and others from self-determination theory have a seat at the table in this NAS policy, and are there methods on psychological needs a strong contributor in the debate for, or the sort of development of eudaimonic well-being measures?
On the poor predictors thing, yeah, there's a huge amount of evidence that people are poor predictors of what will make them happy. I think what the metrics can contribute is giving people information on the strong correlates of well-being today, and at least it will give them better information on which to make those predictions. And the information very clearly says that income matters, but it's overrated, and health matters much more than you think, those kinds of things. So maybe it can ease the mispredicting, but I don't think we can change human nature. And again, there's just this whole issue of people's time horizons, right? On the eudaimonic well-being in the National Academy's work, we're very definitely writing about eudaimonic well-being, but also recognizing that it's the one dimension where we don't have enough robust, tried and true questions to say, oh, we should just stick these into national surveys. So our task is really to make a recommendation for things that would work in the official statistical gathering kind of exercise, that not for what should be researched, and sort of making a distinction about what we know about and what's ready for prime time, what we don't know about that we hope people will do work on, or it could be pilot surveys. So there's, eudaimonia is very much on the table, but it's not ready for prime time. I mean, we just don't know enough about how to measure it well yet.
Peter Denton from Winnipeg in Canada. I really appreciated your presentation, and also like the fact that you made some reference toward the end of the questions about the role of religion in some of these measurements. But from the work that I've been doing, looking at the fundamental nature of an unsustainable industrial culture, what troubles me about your approach and about the issue of whether we measure GDP or GNP or happiness or well-being or whatever else, is that if metricality is an underlying characteristic of an unsustainable culture, then it doesn't much matter what we count or measure, that ultimately it will not lead us in the transformational direction that we need to go. And if you consider that happiness is an internality, we can attempt to guess what it is by virtue of measuring externalities. But I'm led back to the work in 1928 of Sir Arthur Eddington, who was knighted for proving the theory of relativity, was that he said we live in two universes: the metrical universe of things that can be counted and measured, and the non-metrical universe of things that can't. And he said everything of value is in the second. So I wonder, in terms of this desire for transformation of an entire culture, how we can find other means to direct policy than the tools that are metrical in nature.
Well, I mean, I guess I disagree with you in that I think that it's very difficult to base policy on something that you can't measure at all. I don't think metrics are the be-all and end-all, but metrics help us get a gauge on things. And I mean, one of the things that metrics have forced us to do, for example, thinking about even this National Academy's panel exercise, so what is a meaningful change in well-being, right? What is a movement 1 point up the well-being scale mean? What's a meaningful change? And that's a very difficult question to answer. We've done, I think, some good work on it. I've done some real thinking about it. I mean, toss it back and say, what's a meaningful change in income? Right? Well, when I think about that, my main background is as a development and poverty economist, and I can tell you, moving out of poverty in a permanent way, not just above the poverty line and churning back, but getting a household out of poverty to a self-sustaining situation, that's a meaningful change in income to me. I mean, that's versus saying, a 1% change in income or a 2% change in income. But again, you sort of need the metrics to frame those deeper questions, in my view. So in terms of well-being, we're measuring what seems to be correlated with higher levels of well-being given the survey data that we have, trying to make that better survey data, and given the metrics that we have and that are tractable in large N samples. So we may be mismeasuring, or there may be things we're missing, but I think even that exercise is highlighting very different things than just income-based metrics are highlighting, right? And I think to the extent you want to take on the whole sustainability issue and apply these metrics, then, there are plenty of ways one could think of other things to measure about, the nature of consumption and its relation to well-being, a lot of these misprediction things and how do they relate to well-being, the balance of consumer goods to other, to time spent, consuming goods and shopping versus time spent on other activities and how those relate to well-being. There are all kinds of things you can do. It hasn't been done yet, but, and it's your field, not mine. So, I just think the metrics in and of themselves are simply a tool you can use.
Hi, these chairs are not nice. Sue McGregor from Canada, and we didn't plan this question. But my question is, in all these activities that are going on of measuring this subjective experience, which to me is oxymoron, big time, what role is there in all this process for other ways of knowing, like interpretive research, narrative research, which looks at people's people's understandings of the experiences that they're living, and critical power research, which is looking at the power relationships that lead to oppression, and once you understand that, transformation, liberation, change. Is there a balance in the mixed research designs, the mixed methodologies, which are not the same thing, in the initiatives that you're involved with? Or is it basically empirical, positivistic, metric stuff? I'm just curious, that's all. I'm not judging, I'm just curious.
No, it's basically the latter, although there's some very nice, it's the latter, but based then also benchmarked against extensive time use studies and other things that is much more, how are people people's answers to questions as they experience different things using, different measures of different dimensions of well-being and how they correlate with different experiences. There also is some very nice work using vignettes so that we're trying to get a real sense of what people are thinking as they answer these questions and how different frames make a difference to the question, to responses and all kinds of things like that.
Yes, that's a good lead-in for what I wanted to ask or comment, and that is that cognitive research is indicating more and more that there really are two sides of the brain. One axis is the immediate world, and one axis is one's life history since emerging from the womb or maybe before. You're going to get different answers to the questions, or the questions I hear are really focused on this model of us as some kind of thinking machine that answers primarily in the present. But if we're really driven by the part of our brain that remembers everything that's happened since birth, then these questions take on immense cultural, historical significance. And so they may be, the same question is going to evoke a very different answer depending on an individual's life history. It's certainly true, you find very differences in different cultures. So I wonder how you, from a, look at that as a sort of meta problem with everything you do. And it's just, and another comment, you focus, you'd like to work with the Aristotelian view. I do too. I have spent my later part of my life talking mostly about Aristotle and the idea of flourishing. But in Aristotle's time, the culture was based on virtue. The culture was a process-oriented culture, and people measured their lives very differently. So all I'm saying is, how much culture is left out? Is very much the same question that was just asked. How do you, in a practical sense, this gets applied, this is very meaningful in terms of how people's lives are going to be led given the policy, economic context. But eudaimonia was very different for Aristotle than it is today. Even though the idea might be the same, the context in which this is going to happen is fundamentally different. We are in a culture where virtue doesn't mean very much anymore, and leading virtuous lives is not the kind of question that I hear anywhere in your whole series.
Well, big questions and hard to answer quickly, but I'll focus on the, rather than the thinking. I mean, I think we're doing enough with metrics that are measuring momentary answers versus, different time horizons to get a little bit at the different cognitive processes. But on the virtue, we may not be dealing enough with virtue, but I think we have the metrics to at least attempt to deal with it, which is a step above what GNP is doing, right? So that's a start. There are big, huge problems comparing any of these things across cultures, and as you know better than I am sure, but we're also trying to get a sense of that. We find, for example, that if you compare average well-being of Danes and Americans, they're about the same. But Danes are much less likely to pick the extreme responses, so they're less likely to say very happy, and they're less likely to say very unhappy. The averages come out the same. Americans are much more likely to pick the extremes. Part of that is the way Americans are. Part of it's also there's probably more dispersion in well-being in the U.S. than in Danes, but the averages come out the same. So some of that is just culturally determined, how people, they're more moderate in the way they not just respond to surveys, but lots of other things. How does that affect the definition of purpose or meaning is a bigger question, but I think there's enough cross-country work now that's trying to get at least some of these difference, the extent to which cultural differences correlate with differences in well-being levels or in the determinants of well-being, to start to get a handle on that. And I think just trying to measure eudaimonia and what is underlying people's responses to those measures, which again are all in progress, is going to help us at least understand what defines eudaimonia today. We may not like it, we may not like the answer, but...
Well, I'm sure you can continue this discussion over coffee. I'm really sorry to interrupt this wonderful conversation, but we have to. The time is ticking. This was great. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me.
Here, people are really very enlightened. It is a very complex thing. And well, giving is better than receiving, so this will make me happy. But one of the things that makes us most happy is self-promotion. So here you are. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
And I would like to encourage you to visit downstairs the publisher's stands, because there are all kinds of wonderful books there. And again, we have at 3:30 we have our breakout meetings, and then at 5 we have our business meeting for those who want to attend. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for having us.
And wish you a good home.